A small Sahelian country moved faster than global power expected, and the clock never slowed. What appeared to be a technical political adjustment quietly overturned long-standing assumptions about authority, leverage, and who truly controls escalation when pressure suddenly rises. Why should this matter to you now, and why does Ibrahim Traoré suddenly sit at the center of calculations far beyond Burkina Faso's borders? Because what followed was not background noise or symbolic defiance, but a concrete sequence of reactions that forced governments, markets, and institutions to reassess risk in real time. What you are about to hear is not the version of events that circulates most comfortably in headlines or official briefings. It is a clearer account of what actually shifted, why reactions diverged so sharply, and how power behaves when familiar guardrails stop working. You will gain a practical understanding of the mechanisms behind the moment, not just the surface drama. This is not content meant for passive listening. If you stop here, it becomes easy to misread what is happening as another cycle of instability. Rhetoric or regional noise, that shortcut feels reassuring, but it hides incentives that quietly shape decisions made in capitals, boardrooms and security councils. Without seeing those incentives, silence can look like weakness, speed can look like improvisation, and restraint can be mistaken for confusion. More importantly, you risk absorbing explanations designed to calm audiences rather than describe reality. Staying with this analysis means seeing why some actors moved immediately while others hesitated, why economic recalculations preceded public statements, and why legality itself became contested terrain instead of a neutral reference point. In the early days after the shift in Ouagadougou, one detail stood out to analysts watching closely: external reactions did not align with public messaging. Statements sounded cautious, procedural, even restrained, yet behind-the-scenes timelines were being compressed and assumptions revised. That gap between words and actions was the first quiet signal that this moment carried more weight than it initially appeared to. Within weeks, security, diplomatic, and economic responses began adjusting on a noticeably faster cycle, in some cases moving months ahead of normal planning horizons. That acceleration matters because speed reveals priority far more reliably than rhetoric. The context is essential. Burkina Faso had long been treated as strategically important but politically predictable. A country where external actors believed leverage could be applied gradually and reversibly. When Ibrahim Traoré emerged from the 2022 power vacuum, many observers framed it as another transient episode in a familiar regional pattern. But the posture that followed it, rather than signaling short-term accommodation, early decisions emphasized consolidation, control over security choices, and a willingness to absorb friction rather than negotiate it away. This altered the incentive structure for everyone watching. For regional governments, it raised questions about contagion and precedent. For external partners, it complicated risk models built on compliance and gradual adjustment. For financial and humanitarian actors, it blurred lines between technical engagement and political alignment. The first groups to feel the impact were not distant capitals, but intermediaries on the ground. As implementers faced new conditions, security coordinations slowed or rerouted. Commercial actors paused expansion plans, not because of collapse, but because predictability had diminished. Yet together they signaled something larger. The old playbook no longer mapped cleanly onto reality. At that point, it became clear that this was not just a change in leadership, but a change in how leverage itself would be tested going forward. What turned attention from abstract analysis into sustained focus was the emergence of a clear interpretive guide for the situation, not a cheerleader, but observers positioned close enough to see consequences early. Regional security analysts, aid coordinators, and diplomatic staff began converging on the same assessment: the situation was stabilizing in form while destabilizing in expectation. That combination is rare, and it is usually consequential. One senior regional observer described the shift in simple terms. The signals coming out of Ouagadougou were consistent, but they were not calibrated for reassurance. Decisions were being taken with an emphasis on internal coherence rather than external approval, and that choice immediately changed how others had to respond. Issue statements and reassess later. Early alignment or disengagement became real options, each with costs. The first visible impact appeared in security coordination. Channels that once relied on routine consultation slowed, while parallel arrangements hardened. But it removed the comfort of gradual adjustment. Almost simultaneously, development actors reported tighter oversight and clearer political framing around projects that had previously been treated as technical and apolitical. A second confirmation followed quickly. Similar patterns began appearing beyond Burkina Faso's borders, not as identical copies, but as echoes. Neighboring governments watched how external pressure was absorbed rather than deflected, and how internal legitimacy was asserted without the usual signaling rituals. The point was not imitation, but recalibration. By then, it was no longer credible to treat the situation as isolated or temporary. Analysts who had initially downplayed its significance revised their assessments, noting that the pace of change mattered as much as its direction. Ibrahim Traoré had become less important as an individual figure and more important as a reference point for how authority could be exercised under constraint. From that moment, the story stopped being about a single transition and started becoming about a broader test of limits. The sequence that followed unfolded in 3 compressed movements, each tightening the frame around what was possible and what was no longer reversible. It began quietly. A set of decisions landed almost back to back, close enough in time to feel deliberate rather than reactive. External military arrangements were reassessed, then curtailed. But the actions themselves were unambiguous. What had once been treated as provisional suddenly looked directional. Observers who expected gradual signaling realized the trigger had already been pulled. Then the pace accelerated. Reactions multiplied, not in public forums, but in private adjustments. Diplomatic calendars shifted. Contingency plans were reopened. Financial actors moved from wait and see to risk containment. Each step fed the next. And uncertainty became the dominant variable. The logic was no longer about restoring a previous balance, but about preventing exposure if the balance failed to return. As the cycle intensified, responses stacked rather than resolved. Regional organizations issued carefully worded statements while simultaneously preparing enforcement options. Then selectively engaged through narrower channels. Aid flows were reviewed, not halted outright, but refrained with new conditions and tighter oversight. None of these moves alone constituted a rupture. Together, they created a sense of narrowing corridors. This was the climax phase, where escalation became less about dramatic gestures and more about cumulative constraint. Every actor moved to protect downside risk. In particular, became a signal. When reassurance did not arrive on schedule, markets and institutions filled the gap with their own assumptions. Volatility increased not because of a single shock, but because too many actors were acting defensively at once. Throughout this phase, Ibrahim Traoré remained notably consistent in posture. There was no rush to soften decisions for external consumption, nor an attempt to overperform defiance. The emphasis stayed on internal sequencing and coherence. That steadiness unsettled counterparts who were accustomed to bargaining signals or transitional ambiguity. Without those cues, standard playbooks offered fewer off-ramps. The aftershocks followed quickly. Relationships that had relied on predictability now had to be renegotiated under time pressure. Regional partners faced a dilemma between coordination and contagion risk. External governments confronted the limits of influence tools calibrated for slower cycles. Commercial actors, especially those exposed to logistics and resource flows, adjusted projections downward, not because operations had collapsed, but because timelines had become opaque. On the ground, the effects were tangible but uneven. Some programs slowed, others adapted. The common thread was that flexibility now carried a political dimension it previously lacked. Decisions that once lived in technical space were pulled into strategic context. That shift lingered, even as immediate tensions plateaued. By the end of this sequence, one thing was clear: there was no clean reset available. The system had absorbed a shock and settled into a new configuration, less comfortable, more conditional, and harder to reverse. What looked at first like a rapid series of events revealed itself as a structural test. The question left hanging was not whether the pressure would ease, but whether this new equilibrium would harden or fracture next. Before laying out numbers, it helps to reset expectations. This is not about precision forecasting or headline statistics meant to impress. It is about scale, speed, and human exposure, the three dimensions that determine whether a political shift remains manageable or becomes systemic. Start with scale. Burkina Faso sits at the center of a security corridor that affects tens of millions of people across the Sahel. In practical terms, security incidents and displacement trends in the central Sahel have involved millions of civilians over recent years, creating one of the largest sustained humanitarian pressures on the continent. Because even modest percentage shifts translate into large absolute effects. A small deterioration or improvement in access, mobility, or protection can alter daily conditions for entire regions. Now consider speed. Traditionally, adjustments in this environment unfold over long cycles, planning horizons for security cooperation. Aid programming and diplomatic engagement often stretch across quarters or years. What stood out after the consolidation under Ibrahim Traoré was how quickly timelines compressed. Decisions that would normally be phased over many months were implemented within weeks. In operational terms, reaction windows shortened by roughly half compared to standard planning assumptions, forcing actors to respond before full information was available. But it also revealed how seriously the shift was being taken. The third layer is human impact. Numbers here are never abstract. Internal displacement has already affected well over 1 million people, with communities repeatedly uprooted by violence and uncertainty. When policy posture changes alter security coordination or aid delivery, the consequences appear first in these populations. A delayed convoy, a suspended program, or a rerouted partnership does not register as a headline, but it can mean fewer clinics operating, fewer schools reopening, or longer gaps between food distributions. Even small disruptions compound quickly when margins are thin. Economic exposure adds another dimension. Burkina Faso's economy is heavily reliant on primary sectors and external flows. Gold alone accounts for a substantial share of export revenue, linking local stability to global markets. Investors respond not with panic, but with caution. Project timelines stretch. In recent cycles, comparable environments have seen double-digit percentage increases in risk premiums, not because assets vanished, but because confidence did. That drag is gradual but persistent. It is also important to look at regional spillovers. Labor movement and informal markets bind Burkina Faso to its neighbors. When uncertainty increases at the center, peripheral economies absorb shock through price volatility and supply disruption. Food prices, in particular, are sensitive. Even a single-digit percentage rise in transport or security costs can push staple prices beyond reach for vulnerable households. These are not dramatic swings, but they are enough to change daily behavior and social tolerance. Taken together, these figures do not tell a story of immediate collapse. Scale amplifies consequences, speed reduces margin for correction, human exposure ensures that errors are felt quickly and personally. This is why external actors recalibrated so early and so quietly. The numbers did not scream catastrophe, but they signaled that the room for miscalculation was shrinking. The result is a landscape where stability and fragility coexist. Measured not in slogans but in compressed timelines, widened risk bands, and lives lived closer to the edge than before. It is important to acknowledge that not everyone reads this trajectory the same way, and some of the countergamistans deserve to be taken seriously. Dismissing them outright would weaken, not strengthen, the analysis. One common argument is that consolidation under Ibrahim Traoré increases short-term control at the expense of long-term stability. Critics argue that tightening decision loops and prioritizing internal coherence risks isolating Burkina Faso diplomatically and economically. Reduced external cooperation narrows options, raises sanctions exposure, and leaves the country more vulnerable to shocks it cannot absorb alone. Critics warn that autonomy without buffers can turn into fragility if external pressure intensifies. This concern is not baseless. Historical examples across the Sahel show that abrupt breaks with established partners often carry costs before benefits materialize. Financing gaps and security blind spots can accumulate, especially when institutions are still adapting. This argument often assumes that the previous equilibrium was neutral or sustainable. In reality, that equilibrium depended on gradual compliance and deferred risk, which also carried long-term costs that rarely showed up in annual assessments. A second counter-argument focuses on precedent. Some observers worry that the posture adopted in Ouagadougou could normalize rule by exception, encouraging other governments to bypass safeguards in the name of urgency. The danger is less about Burkina Faso itself and more about regional signaling. If assertive consolidation is rewarded or tolerated, it could weaken already fragile norms elsewhere. Again, the concern is rational. Norm erosion is rarely linear, and regional contagion can cut in multiple directions. Yet this view often treats norms as static, rather than contingent. In practice, many regional frameworks have already struggled to enforce consistency, intervening forcefully in some cases while accommodating others. But the visibility of that inconsistency. When both arguments are placed side by side, a clearer picture emerges. The debate is not between stability and chaos, or legality and disorder. It is between two imperfect risk profiles. One favors managed dependency with slower shocks. The other accepts friction up front in exchange for recalibrated leverage later. Understanding that trade-off does not require agreement. It requires recognizing that the choices being made are not irrational, but conditional responses to a narrowing set of options. What shifted the story was not another announcement or confrontation, but a structural move that reframed the entire balance of pressure. Quietly, Burkina Faso stopped behaving like a single, isolated node and began acting as part of a wider strategic alignment. This did not announce itself with spectacle. It showed up in coordination choices, shared language, and synchronized timing that reduced exposure while increasing collective leverage. For analysts, this was the moment prior assumptions broke. Risk models built around isolating one capital no longer held. Diplomatic signaling that relied on bilateral pressure lost clarity. The cost of escalation rose, not because capabilities suddenly expanded, but because consequences became harder to localize. What had been a contained test turned into a distributed one. This mattered because it altered incentives on both sides. External actors now had to consider second-order effects beyond Burkina Faso, weighing silence against alignment. Markets reassessed downside scenarios, factoring in spillovers rather than single-country stress. The story moved from national adjustment to regional geometry. Ibrahim Traoré's role at this midpoint became less about personality and more about sequencing. The emphasis was not on provoking reaction, but on narrowing options available to others. The center of gravity shifted. From here, earlier questions took on new meaning. The issue was no longer whether pressure would be applied, but how widely it would reverberate. That distinction changes outcomes. The consequences of that midpoint shift did not stay abstract for long. They began to surface in concrete ways, touching institutions, markets, daily life, and the wider region almost simultaneously. What had been discussed in analytical language started to register as lived experience. At the state level, pressure condensed around decision-making capacity. Authorities faced tighter timelines, fewer neutral spaces, and a sharper trade-off between flexibility and coherence. Maintaining internal control required clearer priorities and faster execution, while external engagement became more selective. This did not remove agency, but it narrowed margins. Policy errors carried higher costs, and delays were interpreted less generously. For the state, legitimacy increasingly depended not on promises but on delivery under constraint. Businesses felt the effects next. Commercial actors operating in Burkina Faso adjusted behavior well before any dramatic rupture. Investment committees slowed approvals. Logistics firms revised routing assumptions. None of this resembled a sudden collapse. Instead, it was a steady accumulation of friction. But expansion plans were reassessed. The signal was subtle, but consistent predictability mattered more than rhetoric, and when it declined, capital became cautious. For ordinary people, the impact was uneven but real. Changes in security coordination, aid oversight, and market confidence filtered down into everyday routines. In some areas, services continued with little visible disruption. In others, delays and shortages became more frequent. Prices proved especially sensitive when transport costs or security risks increased, even slightly. Staple goods reflected that quickly. For households already operating close to the margin, small increases altered consumption choices, schooling decisions, and mobility. These were not headline-grabbing shifts, but they shaped perception and tolerance over time. The regional dimension amplified everything. Burkina Faso does not operate in isolation. Trade routes, labor flows, and informal markets link it tightly to neighboring states. When uncertainty rose at the center, peripheral economies absorbed spillover through price volatility and supply interruptions. Border communities felt this first. Aware that similar dynamics could cross into their own territories, what might have been treated as a localized adjustment instead became a reference case. Internationally, the recalibration was quieter but deliberate. Diplomatic engagement did not disappear, but it became more conditional. Development actors balanced continuity against compliance. The emphasis shifted from optimism to risk management. This was not punishment in the dramatic sense. It was hedging executed systematically. Across all four layers, a common pattern emerged. The costs were distributed rather than concentrated. No single group absorbed everything at once. But no group remained untouched. That diffusion made the situation harder to dramatize and harder to resolve quickly. In this context, Ibrahim Traore functioned less as a singular cause and more as a focal point around which expectations organized. Their decisions increasingly referenced the same reality: the operating environment had changed, and it was not reverting on its own. The result was a landscape where adjustment replaced anticipation, and where outcomes depended less on declarations than on how long each group could operate under sustained constraint. Looking ahead, the most likely path is neither dramatic collapse nor rapid normalization. Pressure and adaptation continue in parallel. Decision-making remains centralized and fast, external engagement stays selective, and regional coordination reduces some exposure without eliminating friction. Security conditions fluctuate rather than stabilize decisively. Economic activity continues, but at a slower, more cautious pace, with investment flowing only where timelines and control appear credible. In this trajectory, the system does not break, but it also does not relax. It settles into a demanding equilibrium where progress is incremental and mistakes are costly. There is, however, an optimistic scenario that cannot be dismissed. In this version, tighter internal sequencing and regional alignment begin to yield compounding benefits. Security coordination improves enough to reopen key corridors. Administrative reforms reduce leakage and raise basic delivery capacity. External partners, reassured by consistency rather than concessions, gradually re-engage on clearer terms. But it stabilizes. Over time, predictability returns, not because pressure disappears, but because expectations align more closely with reality. This path requires discipline, restraint, and sustained execution. But it offers a plausible route toward reduced volatility. The worst-case scenario looks different, and it does not require a single dramatic failure. It emerges from accumulation. Security setbacks coincide with economic tightening. Regional coordination frays under stress. External pressure becomes more fragmented and more punitive. Small shocks, which might have been absorbed individually, begin to reinforce one another. Public tolerance erodes as prices rise and services strain. In this environment, legitimacy is tested not by ideology, but by endurance. But cascading constraints that narrow options until adjustment becomes reactive rather than strategic. What ties all three scenarios together is uncertainty around timing. None of these outcomes hinge on a single decision or announcement, on whether actions reinforce one another or cancel out. They also depend on how long key actors can operate under pressure without miscalculation. In that sense, leadership matters less as a symbol and more as a system of choices. Ibrahim Traoré's role, and the roles of those responding to him, will be judged by how consistently they manage trade-offs rather than how boldly they state intentions. The most important takeaway is not to predict which scenario will prevail, but to recognize that all three remain viable. The future will be shaped by how quickly actors learn, how honestly they assess risk, and how much margin for error remains when the next test arrives. After following the broader arc, the most relevant question becomes personal rather than geopolitical. What does this shift actually mean for you, as someone watching from the outside, trying to make sense of fast-moving signals without getting pulled into noise? If you are someone who actively tracks global politics, security, or markets, this moment offers an advantage and a warning at the same time. The advantage is clarity. You are seeing how power behaves under constraint, before outcomes are settled and narratives harden. The warning is speed. When timelines compress, early interpretations matter more, and clinging to outdated frameworks can quietly mislead decision-making. Staying useful here means updating assumptions as often as events demand, not as often as headlines change. If you are affected more indirectly, through work, prices, migration, or regional stability, the relevance is still real. Even if it feels distant, political recalibration in one part of the Sahel does not remain neatly contained, and risk perceptions that shape everyday conditions elsewhere. You may not feel it immediately, but delayed effects often arrive without announcement. Rather than assuming continuity, reduces shock when adjustments surface closer to home. And if your instinct is to disengage, to treat this as another faraway crisis with limited relevance, that response is understandable but risky. Moments like this tend to define reference points that are reused later, sometimes in places that feel much closer. Ignoring them does not keep you neutral, it simply leaves you reacting later, with less context and fewer options. Across all three positions, one common thread applies. Understanding does not require taking sides. It requires recognizing patterns early, before they are simplified or weaponized. Whether you act on that understanding professionally, intellectually, or simply as a more informed observer, it gives you leverage over surprise. The question to sit with is not whether this story affects you directly today, but whether you would rather understand it before or after its consequences become obvious. Solutions here cannot live at the level of slogans or declarations. If this trajectory is to remain manageable, action has to be sequenced, measurable, and realistic about constraints. At the central level, leadership has to prioritize execution over signaling. That means narrowing objectives, enforcing discipline across institutions, and measuring success through delivery rather than announcement. For Ibrahim Traoré and the core decision circle, the near-term test is not ideological alignment, but whether security coordination, basic services, and fiscal control can be stabilized within defined timelines. Progress is visible not in speeches, but in reopened routes, functioning administrations, and reduced variance between plans and outcomes. For organizations, businesses, and external partners, the task is adaptation rather than withdrawal. Engagement needs clearer boundaries and shorter feedback loops. Projects should be designed with contingency built in, milestones that can be paused or accelerated, and metrics that reflect operating reality instead of ideal conditions. Stability here is earned through consistency, not optimism. The measure of success is not expansion, but resilience under pressure. At the community and individual level, the most effective actions are practical. Local actors benefit from prioritizing self-sufficiency where possible, sharing information quickly, and adjusting expectations to a higher volatility environment. From diversified income strategies to collective security coordination, can reduce exposure even when structural conditions remain difficult. The goal is not to eliminate risk, but to avoid being blindsided by it. There is also a regional dimension that cannot be ignored. Coordination across borders, whether formal or informal, lowers the cost of shocks and reduces isolation. Shared logistics, information exchange, and synchronized policy timing matter more than grand frameworks. These steps do not require unanimity, only alignment on essentials. The common thread across all levels is follow-through. Plans that are not implemented add noise and erode credibility. Even modest ones compound over time. In this environment, outcomes will be shaped less by intention than by sustained execution. That is where the real leverage now sits. Early in this story, attention focused on signals and posture, on how quickly assumptions were disrupted, in how unfamiliar reactions unfolded. It is worth returning to that moment now, not to repeat it, but to feel how far the arc has moved since then. What began as a narrowly framed transition expanded into a test of endurance, coordination, and belief. Step by step, pressure replaced speculation, and execution replaced rhetoric. Along the way, expectations were stripped down to something more basic. Can choices be sustained when comfort disappears? For Ibrahim Traore, the significance of this period lies less in symbolism than in consequence. The decisions taken did not remain contained within statements or speeches. Markets and households, leaving marks that cannot be undone by narrative alone. Critics and neutral observers were all forced in to the same position of adjustment. That is what gives this moment its emotional weight. It is not a story about inevitability or triumph. It is a story about responsibility under constraint, about accepting that direction carries cost, and that cost is paid over time rather than all at once. Seen this way, the story is no longer just about Burkina Faso or the Sahel. It becomes a reminder that power, once exercised differently, reshapes everyone around it, including those who thought they were only watching. The final image is not one of certainty, but of resolve under pressure, where outcomes remain open. But retreat is no longer simple. What comes after a story like this should not be silence, but reflection shared with others who are also paying attention, shaped by their own experience, distance, and priorities. That diversity of interpretation is not a weakness. It is how understanding deepens. If this analysis helped clarify patterns that often feel blurred or rushed, it may be worth letting others encounter the same perspective before conclusions harden elsewhere. But to widen the space for informed thinking, stories like this tend to travel anyway. The only question is whether they travel as fragments or as context. This is also an invitation to conversation rather than agreement. Some will see risk where others see opportunity. Some will focus on near-term costs, others on longer arcs. All of those views become sharper when they are tested against one another instead of held in isolation. If you choose to engage, do so thoughtfully. Share insights rather than slogans. Ask questions that slow the discussion down rather than inflame it. Communities built around careful attention are rare, but they matter most when events are still unfolding. So consider this an open door, not a directive. If you feel it is worth continuing the discussion, add your perspective and listen to others. According to you, what is the most important factor that will determine how this situation ultimately unfolds?